So Bruno Lasserre, please join us on stage. Of course, you're the chairman of France Competition Authority. What are your thoughts about the words pronounced by Sébastien Soriano and the debate just happening right now on the stage about Europe regulation, or the barbarians at the gate?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank François Barrault and Yves Gassot for inviting me this morning. I thought it would have been more appropriate as a head of a French public agency to talk in French, but Sébastien put me in a trap. And if you don't denounce me as a lawbreaker, well, I would be delighted to switch to English to address you this morning. First of all, all this panel was about regulation. We have to regulate, and is it appropriate to build an OTT regulation on the experience we can draw from the experience we have in the telecom sector? But I think that's not the real question. The real question, and to me is crucial, is why should we regulate and for what? Mm-hmm. And these questions are not debated enough. And I think you can't build a sound and acceptable regulation. You can't have a democratic debate about the rules you want to build if you don't accept a debate on the very reasons why you want to regulate. And to my view, because we live in a market economy where we believe in the capacity of the entrepreneurs to build an efficient economy, I think we can't base a sound regulation if we don't make a relationship between the future of the desirable regulation and a market failure. It is because the market doesn't produce the results we want to achieve that we need to add a regulation. And to me, there are two possible market failures. The first one is, of course, non-questionable. In the fact by itself, the market can't deliver values such as data protection, enlightened consent of the consumer, data portability, which are outside of the market. And I think that is perfectly legitimate for a government to regulate, to protect values which can be delivered by the market itself. So that's why I have no personal opposition to the bill on the Digital Republic, because it tries, in fact, to echo what exists in the traditional, the classical economy to the digital economy in terms of consumer protection, in terms of transparency, fairness. We have made some technical comments I've sent to Axel Lemaire, and I will discuss with her the nature or maybe of the amendments we would like to propose to the bill, but I think it's perfectly legitimate. Much more questionable is the question about should we, in a logic which is not protection of values, but a market and economic regulation, should we, in fact, create a regulation because the market doesn't produce the positive externalities we expect from it? And in the telecom sector, this was the idea. The idea was double. First, to create a market in breaking up monopolies and inviting newcomers to challenge the incumbents. And the other idea was to produce that external externalities, positive externalities, and to create a level playing field in order to allow anybody to compete with the other on the merits. And in that respect, I'm not sure that what we have built in the telecom sector is relevant for the OTTs. And there are, to be very frank, many risks, at least 3 or 4. The first one is an ill-designed regulation, because we don't know everything about OTTs. There is a lot of uncertainty. There is, and we have to accept it, there is a terra incognita. Business models move very fast, and to regulate too early, and to project what we know, what we have experienced to that terra incognita, could be full of, I would say, risks and failures. Second, and I think that's very important, of course, competition law, in fact, is important, and we must admit that many of that platforms borrow some features from what we know in other traditional classical economies. Direct or indirect network effects, two-sided markets, ecosystems, vertical integrations are features we can see in the development of OTTs. But there are many other features which are very peculiar to that digital economy. The winner takes all effect, the first or second mover advantage, the capacity to share very quickly capital, the way data are used and exploited, the fact that we switch more and more from a logic of ownership to a logic of sharing. And we must be humble. We must be humble in admitting that we don't know everything. There is a lot to learn from it, and to regulate, to project something we know to something we don't know, risks to build something which would prove in the future ill-designed. The second risk, and I'm very frank and candid in saying that, is the risk of capture. Of course, there is a temptation from people who are in the market to be protected against those in a Schumpeterian economy who can challenge the positions. And the risk of capture is to convince, and of course that's a temptation, to convince politicians to, in fact, protect rents, to protect incumbents, to protect existing positions against the risk of newcomers. And of course, the risk of that is to stifle innovation and to be inefficient. And last but not the least risk is failure. Not, of course, to have a market failure, but to have a regulatory failure. And if I take the example of the regulation which has been put in place in France to regulate the price relationship between manufacturers and retailers, the Loi Galland and so on, what has been the result? This law hasn't been unable to protect retailers, supposed to be to protect manufacturers, supposed to be weaker than the retailers, and everybody agrees that the regulation, the law takes much time to be elaborated, and the inventivity of the actors is so strong that they can bypass the law, the regulation. So the answer is to add new layers of regulation, which will be bypassed themselves. And in that race between law and the inventivity, in the, I would say, strategic agility of players, the winners will be always the players and not the legislators. So we must accept to discuss that. What are the objectives underlying that need of regulation? Why do we want to regulate? There is something we can take in the existing telecom regulation. It's not so much the content of the regulation, which to my view is inadequate, irrelevant in the OTT regulation, but the method which is employed. I mean, what has been very stimulating, and Sébastien can testify it, is that in the way national regulators can build an ex-ante regulation in the telecom sector, they have to comply with a test. And the test is the following: does the market function well? If yes, no need to regulate. If the market doesn't function well, what are the hurdles? What are the obstacles? And if there are obstacles, is the horizontal competition law able to lift, to solve that problems, that issues. And I think we should do the same exactly for the debate about a likely future or designed OTT regulation. If we have problems, are they able to be solved by the common competition regulation, competition law? And in that respect, it won't surprise you, I will be an advocate of competition law. There are many assets and many strengths in competition law. What are they? There are at least 4 of them. The first one is that competition law is a worldwide law. It was born in the US and imported in Europe after the Second World War. So it's a law, it's a set of rules which is legitimate everywhere and respected, even by new players, internet giants. As US players, they know what antitrust is, they fear it, and they don't challenge, they don't contest its very legitimacy. The second, and we have, exactly like for telecom regulator, we have an ICN, International Competition Network, which gathers more than 130 competition agencies in the world, trying to bring consensus between us and trying to array every agency to a sort of international consensus about best practice, even in the digital economy. And we have in Europe a strong capacity of projection because since 2004, we work in network between the European Commission and the 28 national competition agencies, trying to allocate efficiently cases to assist mutually on the way we investigate and in the way we build a consistent, a coherent competition, I would say, building on a case-by-case approach. The second strength of competition law is its very plasticity. A new regulation has to define what are the subjects of the regulation, what are the rules applicable to them, and what is the sanction if the rules are not complied with. The very advantage of the competition law, which has been designed in the 19th century, is that it's very vaguely worded in order to be applicable to any economic sector, any business configuration. And we have not to rewrite competition law because we face new cases, new sectors, new challenges. The concept of dominance, for example, is very plastic. The concept of abuse is very plastic. We have not a sort of box-ticking exercise saying, well, are you in the wrong case? No, because it's not, I would say, in the law itself prohibited. We have a very plastic approach, provided we prove the potentially anti-competitive effects of a given strategy, we can find an infringement without having the precise words in the law itself. And we have condemned anti-competitive strategies, behaviors, without having to prove, for example, that they were relying on predatory prices, on tying, and so on. Or I would say, for example, anti-competitive rebates. We had to prove only that the strategy which was at stake had potential, or I would say, actual anti-competitive effects, and to be very frank, for example, the capacity to foreclose, I would say, the development of competitors. The third strength of competition law, it is, I would say, fed, it is, I would say, nourished by economic analysis. And its strength is its capacity in analyzing a given strategy, business strategy, to analyze, I would say, subtly and carefully what are the pros and cons, what are the pro-competitive effects of a strategy and the possible anti-competitive effects of the same strategy. And it's very important because in that digital economy, in the business models we observe, it's very important to make a clear assessment of the efficiency gains which are at stake. And there are many. To be very frank, we have to admit that most of that platforms are in their very existence pro-competitive. They're able to match supply and demand, to create a demand. That's the case, for example, for BlaBlaCar and B&B. They create themselves a market which couldn't be addressed in the classical economy. They enlarge the supply. They deepen the supply. So there are clearly gains of efficiency which can be, at the end, good for the consumer and good for consumer welfare. Exactly the same, for example, ecosystems. Are they open or closed? We made a study with our British colleagues showing the pro and anti-competitive effects of open or closed ecosystems. The last but not the least strength of the competition law is that now we have more and more a diversified toolbox. We are not only, I would say, the enforcer who finds an infringement and punishes them. That's a classical image of an ex post regulator which can act when it's too late. No, it's less and less the case. The toolbox is much more open, much more diverse than you can imagine. First, we can prevent, and when we, of course, assess a merger or an acquisition, we can prevent the anti-competitive impact of such an acquisition. It's an ex-ante regulation. And of course, that's fully applicable to the digital economy. We can negotiate commitments in order to correct, to orient, to persuade, and to restructure, I would say, the market, to give new incentives to the players. We can also launch, and the European Commission has done such for the online trade, but we are doing the same in other fields. We can make what we call sectoral inquiries, where we can observe the way markets function and make recommendations in order to lift obstacles to the good functioning of competition in such or such market. There are drawbacks, and I have to be very frank in saying that competition law can't be the only answer. Why? For 3 reasons. The first one is that to act, competition enforcer have to comply with a very demanding standard. And everybody has to understand that. The only existence of a dominant position doesn't justify an action. We have to prove an abuse. And the standard is really demanding. We have to prove that the strategy at stake, whatever the form is, has the capacity to produce, I would say, exclusionary effects, either potential or actual, and foreclose the development of competition and to break up the dynamism of the competition. And of course, the price to pay for that high and demanding standard is time. We have to prove and to meet the standard. We have to answer very sophisticated economic analysis. We have a long, I would say, contradictory debate with firms at stake, and it takes time. Look at the Google investigation, look at other investigations in the internet economy. It can take years and years. And to be very frank, time is the best ally of that internet giant. When we intervene, we can make beautiful, reasoned, sound decisions, but it can be too late to produce the effects we want to achieve. The second, I would say, weakness is, I use the French name, I would say, the angle mort, the dead angle. There is a dead angle in the competition law. It is the situation where firms become, I would say, increasingly dominant, but not by abusing their dominant position, or not necessarily by abusing their dominant position, or by acquiring other firms. It is because these companies are very wealthy, they have immense capital opportunities, they are very agile, very careful about all the possibilities to challenge their market power and invest in every niche which could challenge their actual dominance. And that's not forbidden by competition law. If you're agile enough and rich enough to neutralize potential competition by investing where you feel yourselves as weak, while you acquire nation players, it's not forbidden, or it cannot be assessed through the classical merger and acquisition net. So what are the answers to me? The first, and I would make my conclusions around that, the first one is maybe to have a democratic debate about the desired regulation, have a thorough, careful, and important discussion debate about the reasons why we want to regulate. There are good and bad reasons, and to me, the bad reasons would be to have a regulation which would redistribute the rents. That's not, I would say, a good reason. It's not the good justification of a possible regulation. Second, we have to transform the existing regulation in every domain, tax, labor, any regulation, capital market, financing, and so on. We have to transform the existing regulation in order to make them more welcoming to digital economies, to enable startups to develop. The third recommendation would be to encourage the risk among regulators and antitrust enforcers. We can't rely, I would say, on what we know. We can't be arrogant or lazy, both in saying, well, let's see, or in trying to replicate what we know in the terra incognita, which is in front of us. So I encourage la prise de risque. And the best way, for example, to do it in the antitrust arena is to encourage interim injunctions. In France, we don't dare using that. Since 2000, we have imposed more than 30 interim injunctions in a very limited period of time, 3 or 4 months after the complaint was lodged to us. And we made it in the Google case, the Navix case, in the Apple case, in the Cogent case, in many cases. We didn't dare. After a sort of prima facie assessment of the case, we issued an interim injunction stopping the behavior at stake. And then we created a rapport de force which were much more favorable to us and allowed a quicker and maybe a more efficient issue at the substantive case at stake. And I encourage the European Commission and the other antitrust agencies in Europe, which have that power, which is in the toolbox they can use to make a more intensive use of that instrument, because time must be the ally of the competition agency and not of the internet giants who take benefit of the time. The fourth and the last proposal I would make is maybe to assess in a more modern way market power. To be very frank, and I must be humble in admitting that, we are too focused on turnover, on market shares, and not on maybe new ways, modern ways, to take market power. And of course, the question is about data. Data matters, and matters a lot. And I think we should, as competition enforcers, take into consideration market power, which is derived more and more, not so much from the importance of the turnover we make, but from the capacity we have to collect, to exploit, to sell personal data which have an immense commercial value, and that not so much taken into account in competition law. We have launched with our German counterpart, the Bundeskartellamt, a study on that, the articulation, the relationship between competition and data in the context of big data. What can we say about a primary or secondary data market? How we can assess market power derived on that possibility of collection and exploitation of personal data. There is a lot to do about that, and I take a very simple example. Facebook, WhatsApp. WhatsApp, the figures were, I remember, when Facebook acquired WhatsApp, was about, I think, 15 million euros or dollars as turnover, but a stock exchange value, market value, which was $22 billion. So why that difference? It is because the market anticipated the use WhatsApp can make of the immense stock of personal data it has been able to collect. That are the good challenges we should face, and I must apologize for, first, my bad and maybe laborious, very English, but more the time I took to address maybe that very boring issues, which I hope will, at the end, stimulate us and enable us, I quote Emmanuel Macron as well, enable us to have a good debate.
Actually, from what I can read on Twitter right now, your English is just perfect first. And then, I mean, I think everyone was just stunned by, the quality of the remarks you were just making. And again, it's quite challenging to see that sometimes regulation can be rock at the same time.
Thank you.
Thank you.